The wrench slipped from my greasy fingers and clanged against the concrete floor of my garage. I was lying under my old Ford pickup, trying to fix a transmission leak that had been dripping oil onto my driveway for weeks. The familiar smell of motor oil and rust filled my nostrils as I reached for the wrench again, my back aching from the awkward position. That's when Dominique stormed in. I could hear her heels clicking against the concrete, each step sharp and deliberate like bullets hitting pavement. She was wearing those expensive pumps she'd bought last month, the ones that cost more than I made in a week at the construction site. I didn't need to see her face to know she was angry. After 18 years of marriage, I could read her moods by the sound of her footsteps. "Victor," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet evening air like a blade. "We need to talk." I slid out from under the truck, wiping my hands on an old rag. Dominique stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading sunset. She looked perfect, as always. Her blonde hair was pulled back in that sleek style she'd adopted since starting at the advertising agency downtown. Her makeup was flawless, her navy blue business suit pressed and professional. She looked like she belonged in a magazine, not in my cluttered garage. "What's on your mind?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew. She stepped closer, her green eyes flashing with something I couldn't quite identify. Contempt, maybe. Disappointment. "I've been thinking about us, Victor. About what we've become." I set the wrench down on my workbench and turned to face her fully. "And what's that?" "You know what Garrett told me today?" She didn't wait for me to answer. "He said that real men take charge. They don't just sit around waiting for life to happen to them." Garrett Stone. Of course. Her ex-boyfriend from college, the one who'd been sniffing around ever since he moved back to town 6 months ago. The real estate tycoon with his fancy suits and expensive car. The one Dominique had been mentioning more and more frequently in our conversations. "My ex knows how to take control," she continued, her voice gaining momentum. "You just sit there like a dog." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt something shift inside me, something fundamental and irreversible. For 18 years, I'd been the patient husband, the understanding partner, the guy who worked extra shifts to pay for her business school, who supported her career ambitions, who never complained when she came home late from client dinners. I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile or a happy one. It was the kind of smile a man gives when he finally understands a joke that's been played on him for years. The kind of smile that says the game has changed and the rules are about to be rewritten. "Is that what you think?" I asked quietly. She seemed taken aback by my calm response. Maybe she'd expected me to argue, to defend myself, to beg for another chance. Instead, I just stood there, still smiling that cold, knowing smile. "It's what I know," she said, but there was less certainty in her voice now. I nodded slowly, as if I was considering her words carefully. "Well, Dominique, I guess we'll see about that." I turned back to my workbench and began cleaning my tools, my movements deliberate and unhurried. She stood there for another moment, clearly expecting more of a reaction. When it didn't come, she huffed in frustration and clicked back toward the house. "I'm going to Sasha's for the evening," she called over her shoulder. "Don't wait up." The garage fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic on the main road. I finished cleaning my tools, put them away in their proper places, and closed the hood of my truck. Then I went inside and began making phone calls. The first call was to Mike Latham, my oldest friend and the guy who'd taught me everything I knew about construction. Mike had been through his own messy divorce 3 years ago, and he'd learned some valuable lessons about protecting yourself when a marriage goes sideways. "Mike," I said when he answered. "It's Victor. I need some advice." "What's going on, buddy?" "How fast can you move money out of a joint account without your spouse knowing?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Vic, what's happening?" "The dog is learning to bite," I said, "and I'm going to need your help." The second call was to Jerry Morrison, a guy I'd done some contracting work for who happened to be a bank manager. The third was to my cousin Danny, who owned a moving company. The fourth was to a storage facility on the other side of town. By the time I finished making arrangements, it was nearly midnight. Dominique still wasn't home. I sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee and thinking about the last 18 years of my life, about all the times I'd bitten my tongue when she criticized me in front of her friends, about all the late nights she'd spent working while I waited at home, about all the little comments and cutting remarks that had slowly eroded my self-respect. She thought I was a dog. She thought I was passive and weak and controllable. She was about to learn how wrong she was. I went upstairs to our bedroom and began packing. Not everything. That would be too obvious. Just the essentials. My clothes, my personal documents, the few things that really mattered to me. I worked quietly and efficiently, years of construction work having taught me to be methodical and thorough. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd called me a dog, but dogs are loyal creatures. They stay by your side through thick and thin. They protect their pack. They ask for nothing but a little affection in return. I'd been the perfect dog for 18 years, but even the most loyal dog will bite if you kick it enough times. I loaded my truck with the boxes and drove them to the storage unit. Then I came back and waited. Dominique's car pulled into the driveway at 2:30 in the morning. I heard her stumble slightly as she came up the front steps. She'd been drinking. I pretended to be asleep when she slipped into bed beside me, reeking of wine and expensive cologne that definitely wasn't mine. At 6 a.m., while she was still sleeping off whatever she'd been doing at Sasha's, I made my final preparations. I transferred our joint savings to an account she didn't know about, perfectly legal, since my name was on everything. I canceled the credit cards that were in my name, but that she used for her shopping sprees. I called the utility companies and had the services transferred to her name only. Then I loaded the rest of my belongings into my truck and drove away. She wanted a man who took control. She was about to get exactly what she'd asked for. I checked into the Sunset Motel on Highway 12, about 20 miles outside of town. It was the kind of place that rented rooms by the week and didn't ask too many questions. The carpet was worn, the wallpaper was peeling, and the air conditioning unit rattled like it was on its last legs. It was perfect. From my window, I could see the interstate stretching out toward the horizon. 18-wheelers rumbled past at all hours, carrying their loads to destinations unknown. I felt a kinship with those drivers, men on the road, free from the complications of domestic life, answerable to no one but themselves. My phone had been buzzing since 8 a.m. 15 missed calls from Dominique, 23 text messages that grew increasingly frantic as the morning wore on. I read them all, but I didn't respond. Not yet. The first few were confused. "Where are you? Your clothes are gone." Then angry. "This is ridiculous, Victor. Come home right now." Then panicked. "The bank account is empty. What did you do?" Then desperate. "Please call me. We can work this out." I made coffee using the little machine in my room and sat down to plan my next move. Dominique thought she knew me, thought she could predict my behavior. She expected me to come crawling back, apologizing and begging for forgiveness. That's what the old Victor would have done. But the old Victor was gone. I drove to the gym where Mike worked as a trainer. Iron Mike's boxing club was located in an old warehouse on the wrong side of town, the kind of place where guys went to work out their frustrations with heavy bags and speed bags instead of therapists and prescription medications. The smell of sweat and leather filled the air, and the sound of gloves hitting bags provided a steady rhythm that was almost meditative. Mike was wrapping his hands when I walked in. He looked up and grinned, but the smile faded when he saw my expression. "You did it," he said. It wasn't a question. "I did it." He nodded approvingly. "How's it feel?" "Like I've been sleepwalking for 18 years, and I finally woke up." Mike finished wrapping his hands and gestured toward the heavy bags. "Want to work out some of that energy?" For the next hour, I pounded the bag until my knuckles were raw, and my shirt was soaked with sweat. With every punch, I thought about Dominique's words from the night before. With every combination, I felt myself getting stronger, more focused, more determined. "So what's the plan?" Mike asked as we cooled down. "I'm going to give her exactly what she asked for," I said. "She wants a man who takes control. She's going to see what that really looks like." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Just don't do anything stupid, Vic. Don't give her ammunition to use against you in court." "I'm not going to break any laws," I assured him, "but I'm not going to roll over and surrender either." After leaving the gym, I drove to the industrial district where Dominique's advertising agency was located. Sterling and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming glass tower that looked completely out of place among the old factories and warehouses that surrounded it. I parked across the street and waited. At 12:30, Dominique emerged from the building with her friend Sasha Klein. Even from a distance, I could see that Dominique looked frazzled. Her usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled, and she kept checking her phone obsessively. Sasha, on the other hand, looked perfectly composed. She was a tall brunette with the kind of calculated beauty that came from expensive treatments and designer clothes. She'd been Dominique's best friend since college, and I'd never liked her. There was something predatory about the way she looked at other people's husbands, something calculating in her smile. They went to lunch at an upscale bistro downtown. I followed at a distance, parking where I could watch the restaurant entrance. They sat at a table by the window, and I could see them talking animatedly. Dominique was gesturing frantically, while Sasha listened with that sympathetic expression she was so good at faking. After lunch, they went back to the agency. I waited until 5 o'clock, when the building emptied out for the day. Dominique didn't emerge with the crowd. She was probably working late, trying to distract herself from her personal problems. I drove to Sasha's apartment complex, an upscale development called Riverside Gardens. I knew where she lived because Dominique had dragged me to several of her parties over the years. I parked in the visitors section and waited. Sasha arrived at 6:15, driving her red BMW convertible. She parked in her assigned spot and headed toward the building entrance. I got out of my truck and intercepted her. "Sasha!" I called out. She turned, and her face went through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, concern, and something that might have been calculation. "Victor," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I'm so sorry about what's happening between you and Dominique." "Are you?" She stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of her expensive perfume. "Of course I am. You two seem so happy together." I almost laughed at that. "Did we?" "Well," she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "I always thought Dominique was too hard on you. You're a good man, Victor. You deserve better." "That's interesting," I said, "because Dominique told me you agreed with her assessment of our marriage." Sasha's eyes widened slightly. "I would never—" "She said you told her that she needed a man who could match her ambition, someone more like Garrett Stone." Now Sasha looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Victor, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "Has there?" She glanced around the parking lot, as if checking to make sure we were alone. Then she stepped even closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her body. "You know," she said, her voice taking on a different quality, "I've always found you attractive. If Dominique doesn't appreciate what she has—" She let the sentence hang in the air between us, her implication clear. I felt a moment of genuine surprise. Was Sasha Klein, Dominique's best friend, actually trying to seduce me? "That's very flattering," I said carefully. "I mean it," she said, reaching out to touch my arm. "You're strong, you're reliable, you're real. Not like these corporate types who are all talk and no substance." "Like Garrett Stone?" Her hand froze on my arm. "What about Garrett?" "Just wondering what you think of him, since he's apparently the standard Dominique is measuring me against." Sasha's expression shifted again, becoming more guarded. "Garrett is complicated." "How so?" She glanced around again, then seemed to make a decision. Can we go somewhere private? There are things about this situation that you don't understand. 20 minutes later, we were sitting in a corner booth at Mulligan's, a dive bar on the outskirts of town. The kind of place where the beer was cheap, the lighting was dim, and nobody paid attention to other people's conversations. Sasha had ordered a martini, which looked absurdly out of place in the blue-collar atmosphere. I stuck with beer. Garrett Stone isn't what he appears to be, she said, without preamble. Meaning? Meaning his real estate empire is built on borrowed money and borrowed time. He's leveraged to the hilt, and there are rumors that some of his recent deals haven't been entirely legitimate. I took a sip of my beer and waited for her to continue. Dominique doesn't know any of this, Sasha continued. She sees the expensive car, the fancy clothes, the big house on the lake. She thinks he's successful. And you know better? I hear things. My ex-husband works in commercial lending. Garrett's been turned down by every major bank in the state. This was interesting, but I wasn't sure why Sasha was telling me. What's your point? She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. My point is that Dominique is making a mistake. A big one. And when it all comes crashing down, she's going to need someone to catch her. Someone like me? Someone like you. I studied her face in the dim light. There was something she wasn't telling me. Something important. Sasha, why are you really here? Why are you telling me this? She took a large gulp of her martini before answering. Because I care about both of you. And because... She hesitated, then seemed to steel herself. Because Dominique isn't just having an emotional affair with Garrett. They've been sleeping together for 3 months. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, even though part of me had already suspected as much. Hearing it confirmed was different than wondering about it. How do you know? She told me. She tells me everything. Sasha reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. I'm sorry, Victor. I know this must be devastating. I looked down at her hand on mine. Her skin was soft and warm, her nails perfectly manicured. Where do they meet? His lake house. Every Tuesday and Thursday she tells everyone at work that she has client meetings in the evening. And you've known about this for 3 months? I tried to talk her out of it, Sasha said quickly. I told her she was throwing away a good marriage for a fantasy, but she wouldn't listen. I pulled my hand away from hers and finished my beer. Thanks for telling me. Victor, she said as I started to stand up. I meant what I said earlier, about finding you attractive. If you ever want to talk, or if you need anything, I'll keep that in mind. I left her sitting in the booth and walked out into the night air. My truck felt like a sanctuary after the claustrophobic atmosphere of the bar. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, processing what I'd learned. Dominique and Garrett were meeting at his lake house twice a week. Sasha knew about it and had known for months. And now Sasha was making a play for me, probably figuring that I'd be vulnerable and grateful for the attention. I started the engine and drove back toward the motel, but instead of going straight there, I took a detour toward Mills Lake. I wanted to see this famous lake house for myself. The Stone property was easy to find. It was the biggest house on the lake, a sprawling modern monstrosity that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Security lights illuminated the circular driveway, and I could see a 3-car garage attached to the main house. I parked on a side road about a 1/4 mile away and walked back through the woods. The house was dark except for a few landscape lights, and Garrett's silver Porsche was nowhere to be seen. I made my way closer, staying in the shadows of the trees that surrounded the property. The house was even more ostentatious up close. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a wraparound deck, a boat dock that probably cost more than my annual salary. This was the life Dominique wanted, the life she thought she deserved. I was about to head back to my truck when I heard the sound of an approaching car. I crouched behind a cluster of pine trees as headlights swept across the driveway. The silver Porsche pulled up to the front entrance, followed closely by a familiar blue sedan. Dominique's car. I watched as Garrett got out of his car and walked over to open Dominique's door for her. Even from a distance, I could see that she was dressed differently than usual, a short black dress that I'd never seen before, heels that made her legs look impossibly long. She laughed at something he said, and the sound carried across the still night air. They disappeared into the house, and lights began coming on in the windows. I stayed hidden in the trees, watching and waiting. Part of me wanted to storm up to the house and confront them, but I forced myself to remain calm and think strategically. After about an hour, I made my way back to my truck. I had seen enough for one night, but as I drove back to the motel, I was already planning my next move. Dominique wanted a man who took control. Garrett Stone thought he was untouchable because of his money and status. They both thought I was just going to fade quietly into the background. They were about to learn how wrong they were. I woke up the next morning with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The sun was streaming through the thin curtains of my motel room, and I could hear the distant sound of traffic on the interstate. I made coffee, showered, and sat down to plan the next phase of my campaign. My phone showed 37 missed calls from Dominique and a voicemail box that was completely full. I deleted all the messages without listening to them. Whatever she had to say, I wasn't interested in hearing it. Instead, I called Jerry Morrison at the bank. "Victor," he said when he came on the line, "I was wondering when I'd hear from you. Your wife was here yesterday asking about the accounts." "What did you tell her?" "The truth, that you had every legal right to transfer the funds, since your name was on all the accounts. She wasn't happy about it." I could imagine. "Jerry, I need to ask you about something else. What do you know about Garrett Stone's financial situation?" There was a pause. "Victor, you know I can't discuss other customers' private information." "I'm not asking for account numbers or balances. I just want to know if the rumors about him being in financial trouble are true." Another pause. "Let me put it this way. If I were you, I wouldn't invest in any of his development projects." That was all I needed to know. My next call was to Mike at the gym. "I need you to do me a favor," I said. "I need you to find out everything you can about Garrett Stone's business dealings. Quietly." "What kind of everything?" "Property records, business partnerships, lawsuits, liens, anything that's a matter of public record." "I know a guy who works at the courthouse," Mike said. "Give me a couple days." After that, I drove to the storage unit where I'd stashed my belongings and retrieved a few items I was going to need. Then I headed back to Mills Lake. In the daylight, the Stone property looked even more impressive. The house was situated on about 5 acres of prime lakefront property, with mature trees providing privacy from the neighboring estates. A long driveway wound through the trees before opening up to reveal the house in all its ostentatious glory. I parked on the same side road I'd used the night before and walked through the woods to get a better look at the property. There was a security system, but it seemed to be focused on the house itself rather than the grounds. The perimeter was marked by a low stone wall that was more decorative than functional. I spent an hour studying the layout, noting the locations of the security cameras, the motion sensors, and the various entry points. Then I went back to my truck and drove to the hardware store in town. I bought a bag of sugar, a can of spray paint, and a few other supplies. The teenage clerk barely looked up from his phone as he rang up my purchases. That evening I returned to the lake house. Garrett's Porsche was parked in the driveway, and lights were on throughout the house. I could see figures moving past the windows, at least 2 people, maybe more. I made my way to the 3-car garage, staying in the shadows and avoiding the security cameras. The side door was locked, but the lock was old and cheap. It took me less than 2 minutes to pick it with tools I'd learned to use during my construction days. Inside the garage, I found exactly what I was looking for. In addition to the Porsche, there was a black BMW SUV and a red Ferrari that looked like it had never been driven. All 3 vehicles were parked with military precision, their paint jobs gleaming under the overhead lights. I started with the Porsche. I poured sugar into the gas tank, Not enough to cause permanent damage, but enough to ensure that the car wouldn't start in the morning. Then I moved on to the BMW and repeated the process. The Ferrari was a different story. This wasn't just a car, it was a trophy, a symbol of everything Garrett Stone thought he was. I took out the can of spray paint and wrote, "The dog was here," across the hood in large, dripping letters. Then I heard voices coming from the direction of the house. I froze, listening carefully. 2 people were walking across the deck, their voices carrying clearly in the still night air. "I should probably head home," I heard Dominique say. "It's getting late." "Stay a little longer," Garrett replied. "The night is still young." I could hear the sound of a sliding door opening, and then their voices became muffled as they went back inside. I waited a few more minutes, then made my way toward the house. The deck wrapped around 3 sides of the building, with large windows providing a clear view into the interior. I crept along the side of the house until I found a position where I could see into what appeared to be the living room. Dominique was sitting on a white leather couch, a glass of wine in her hand. She was wearing the same black dress I'd seen her in the night before, but now her hair was mussed and her lipstick was smeared. Garrett was standing by a massive stone fireplace, gesturing expansively as he talked about something. I took out my phone and started recording. "You have to understand," I could hear Garrett saying through the slightly open window. "Men like your husband are a dime a dozen. They're worker bees, drones. They don't have vision or ambition." "I know," Dominique replied. "I've wasted so many years trying to motivate him, trying to push him to be more than he is. But he's content to just exist." "You deserve better," Garrett said, moving closer to the couch. "You deserve a man who can match your intelligence, your drive, your passion." He sat down next to her and put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, and I watched as he kissed her neck. I kept recording. "Sometimes I feel like I'm married to a piece of furniture," Dominique said. "He just sits there, taking up space, never really contributing anything meaningful to our life together." "Well, you won't have to deal with that much longer," Garrett said. "Once you file for divorce, you can start fresh. We can start fresh." "What about his claim on the house?" "Don't worry about that. I know lawyers who specialize in making those kinds of problems disappear. By the time they're done with him, he'll be lucky to walk away with his truck." They both laughed, and the sound made my stomach turn. But I kept recording. "I almost feel sorry for him," Dominique said. "He has no idea what's coming." "He's a grown man," Garrett replied. "He should have seen the writing on the wall years ago. If he was too stupid or too lazy to fight for his marriage, that's his problem." I had enough. I backed away from the window and made my way toward the driveway, being careful to avoid the security cameras. But as I reached the edge of the property, motion sensor lights suddenly blazed to life, illuminating me like I was on a stage. I heard shouts coming from the house, and I ran for the woods. Behind me, I could hear the sound of the front door slamming open and Garrett's voice yelling something about calling the police. I made it to my truck and drove away as fast as I dared, my heart pounding with adrenaline. But I was also smiling. I had everything I needed. The next morning, I woke up to find 17 new voice messages from Dominique. This time I listened to a few of them. The first was angry. "I know it was you at Garrett's house last night. This is harassment, Victor, and I'm going to call the police." The second was pleading. "Please, we need to talk. This has gotten completely out of hand." The third was desperate. "I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry for what I said, but destroying property isn't going to solve anything." I deleted all the messages and got dressed. Then I drove to a print shop in the next town over, where I made copies of some still frames from the video I'd recorded. The images were grainy, but clear enough to show Dominique and Garrett in an obviously intimate situation. My next stop was the post office, where I mailed anonymous copies of the photos to Dave Milan, Dominique's boss at the advertising agency. I also mailed copies to 3 other executives at the company, along with a brief note explaining that one of their employees was using company time for personal affairs. Then, I drove to Garrett's real estate office, a glass-fronted building in the upscale part of downtown. I waited until I saw him arrive in a rental car. Apparently the Porsche wasn't running this morning. And then I went inside. The receptionist was a young woman with blonde hair and too much makeup. "Can I help you?" "I'd like to speak with Mr. Stone about a property investment opportunity." "Do you have an appointment?" "Tell him it's about the Mills Lake development. He'll want to see me." She made a phone call, spoke quietly for a moment, then hung up. "He'll see you now. Third office on the right." Garrett's office was exactly what I'd expected. Expensive furniture, awards on the walls, and a view of the city skyline. Garrett himself was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, trying to project an image of power and success. But I could see the stress lines around his eyes, and his smile looked forced. "Mr. Mercer," I said, taking a seat in one of the leather chairs across from his desk. "Victor Mercer." His face went pale. "What do you want?" "I want to have a conversation, man to man." He glanced toward the door, probably wondering if he should call for security. "If this is about last night, it's about my wife," I said calmly. "And it's about you. And it's about what happens next." "Look, Victor, can I call you Victor? I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding. I know exactly what's been going on. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Garrett straightened his tie and tried to regain his composure. "I don't know what Dominique has told you, but she hasn't told me anything. She doesn't need to. I have eyes." "Okay, fine. Yes, Dominique and I have been seeing each other. But your marriage was already over, Victor. She told me so herself." "Is that what she told you?" "She said you two had been living like roommates for years. No intimacy, no communication, no shared goals or dreams. She said she felt trapped." I leaned back in my chair and studied his face. "And you believed her?" "Why wouldn't I?" "Because men like you always believe what you want to hear. It makes it easier to justify taking what doesn't belong to you." Garrett's jaw tightened. "I didn't take anything. She came to me." "Did she? Or did you pursue her?" "That's irrelevant." "Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you targeted a married woman, fed her a bunch of lies about her husband, and convinced her that she deserved better. Classic predator behavior." "You don't know what you're talking about." I pulled out my phone and showed him a still frame from the video I'd recorded the night before. His face went white. "You were saying?" He stared at the image for a long moment, then looked back up at me. "What do you want?" "I want you to stay away from my wife." "And if I don't?" I stood up and walked over to his window, looking out at the city below. "You know, Garrett, I've been doing some research on you. Interesting financial situation you've got yourself in." "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you do. You're leveraged to the hilt, your credit lines are maxed out, and you're about 6 months away from bankruptcy. This whole successful businessman act is just that, an act. You're fishing." I turned back to face him. "Am I? Then you won't mind if I share some of this information with your business partners, or your clients, or the local newspaper." "You wouldn't." "Try me." We stared at each other across the office, two men who had nothing left to lose. Finally, Garrett looked away. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm not proposing anything. I'm telling you. Stay away from Dominique, or I'll make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of man you really are." "And what kind of man is that?" I smiled that cold smile again. "The kind who preys on other men's wives because he can't get a woman of his own." I walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at him. "Oh, and Garrett? You might want to check your security cameras from last night. I think you'll find them very educational." I left him sitting behind his desk and walked out of the building. The morning sun felt warm on my face, and I realized that for the first time in months, I felt genuinely happy. The dog had learned to bite, and the taste was surprisingly sweet. 3 days later, Mike called me with the information I'd requested about Garrett Stone. We met at the gym, and he handed me a manila folder thick with documents. "Your boy Garrett is in deeper trouble than I thought," Mike said as I flipped through the papers. "He owes money to half the contractors in the state. He's got 3 lawsuits pending against him for breach of contract, and the IRS has placed liens on 2 of his properties. I studied a property record that showed Garrett's lake house was actually owned by a shell company that was itself owned by a bank in Chicago." "He doesn't even own the house?" "Nope. It's all smoke and mirrors, Vic. The guy's living off credit and borrowed time." "What about his business partners?" "That's the interesting part. Turns out one of his main investors is connected to some pretty unsavory people. The kind of people who don't like it when their investments don't pay off." I closed the folder and looked at Mike. "How long before it all comes crashing down?" "Based on what I'm seeing here? Maybe 6 months, maybe less. He's been robbing Peter to pay Paul, but he's running out of Peters." That evening, I drove back to Mills Lake. I wanted to see the house one more time before I made my final move. The property looked the same as always, impressive, expensive, and completely fake. I was about to leave when I saw headlights coming up the driveway. Not 1 car, but 3. I crouched behind the stone wall and watched as the vehicles parked in front of the house. Garrett got out of the first car, followed by Dominique. But it was the occupants of the other 2 cars that caught my attention. 4 men in expensive suits, the kind of men who looked like they'd be equally comfortable in a boardroom or a back alley. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told the story. Garrett was gesturing frantically, trying to explain something. The men listened impassively, their faces showing no emotion. Dominique stood to one side, looking confused and frightened. After about 10 minutes, the men got back in their cars and drove away. Garrett and Dominique went into the house, and I could see them through the windows, having what appeared to be a heated argument. I had seen enough. I drove back to the motel and began planning the final phase of my campaign. The next morning, I called Dominique's office. Her assistant answered on the second ring. "Sterling and Associates, this is Jennifer." "Is Dominique Mercer available?" "I'm sorry, Ms. Mercer is no longer with the company. Can someone else help you?" "Interesting. When did she leave?" "I'm not authorized to discuss personnel matters. Would you like to speak with someone else?" I hung up and immediately called Sasha's number. "Victor," she said when she answered. "I was hoping you'd call. What happened to Dominique's job?" There was a pause. "You don't know?" "Know what?" "She was fired yesterday. Someone sent photos to her boss showing her with Garrett during what were supposed to be client meetings. Dave Millant called it a breach of professional conduct and terminated her immediately." I felt a surge of satisfaction. "That's unfortunate. Victor, I need to see you. There are things happening that you need to know about." "What kind of things?" "Not over the phone. Can you meet me tonight?" We arranged to meet at Mulligan's at 8 o'clock. I spent the rest of the day driving around town thinking about how dramatically my life had changed in just 1 week. 7 days ago, I'd been a married man with a steady job and a predictable routine. Now I was living in a motel, my wife was unemployed and having an affair, and I was systematically destroying the life of her lover. It should have felt wrong. It should have made me feel guilty or ashamed. Instead, it made me feel more alive than I had in years. Sasha was already waiting when I arrived at Mulligan's. She was sitting in the same corner booth we'd used before, but this time she looked nervous. Her usual composed demeanor was cracked, and she kept glancing toward the door as if she expected someone to follow her in. "You look like you've seen a ghost," I said as I sat down across from her. "Maybe I have." She signaled the waitress for another drink. "Victor, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it." "I'm listening." "The photos that got Dominique fired, that was you, wasn't it?" I didn't answer, but my expression must have given me away. "I thought so." She took a large gulp of her martini. "You need to be careful. Garrett is not the kind of man you want to cross." "What do you mean?" I mean, he has connections. Dangerous connections. The kind of people who solve problems permanently. I thought about the men I'd seen at the lake house the night before. You're talking about his business partners. She nodded. Garrett owes them a lot of money he doesn't have. And now, with his reputation damaged and his girlfriend unemployed, he's getting desperate. How do you know all this? Sasha looked uncomfortable. Because I've been helping him. The words hit me like a physical blow. What? I've been feeding him information about Dominique, about your marriage, your finances, your weaknesses. I've been helping him manipulate her. I stared at her across the table, trying to process what she'd just told me. Why? Because 3 years ago, you cost me my marriage and my job. Remember? You caught my husband and me together at that construction site, and you told his wife. She divorced him, took half his money, and I got fired from your company for sleeping with a married client. The memory came flooding back. I'd been working late on a project when I'd discovered Sasha in a compromising position with Jim Patterson, one of our biggest clients. Jim was married with 3 kids, and I'd felt obligated to tell his wife what I'd seen. The fallout had been swift and brutal. Jim's wife had filed for divorce, and my company had terminated its relationship with both Jim and Sasha to avoid any potential scandal. So this is revenge, I said. This is justice, she corrected. You destroyed my life because you thought you were being righteous. Now I'm returning the favor. And Dominique? Dominique is collateral damage. She was always going to leave you eventually. I just helped speed up the process. I felt a cold rage building in my chest. You manipulated my wife into having an affair. I opened her eyes to what she was missing. There's a difference. Is there? Sasha leaned forward, her eyes glittering with malice. You want to know the best part? She actually believes Garrett loves her. She thinks they're going to get married and live happily ever after in that big house by the lake. But that's not going to happen. Of course not. Garrett doesn't love anyone but himself. Once he gets tired of her, or once she becomes too much of a liability, he'll discard her like yesterday's newspaper. I stood up from the table, my hands clenched into fists. You destroyed my marriage for revenge. You destroyed my marriage for self-righteousness. At least I'm honest about my motives. I walked out of the bar without another word. But as I drove back to the motel, I realized that Sasha had given me exactly what I needed, the final piece of the puzzle. She thought she was the puppet master, pulling all the strings. Garrett thought he was the alpha male, taking whatever he wanted. Dominique thought she was the victim, trapped in a loveless marriage. They were all wrong. I was the one in control now, and it was time to end this game once and for all. The next evening was Thursday, which meant Dominique would be at the lake house with Garrett. I drove there just after sunset, parking in my usual spot and making my way through the woods to the house. But this time, I wasn't planning to hide in the shadows and take pictures. This time, I was going inside. The security system was more sophisticated than I'd initially thought, but I'd spent enough time studying it to find its weaknesses. The cameras covered the obvious entry points, but they missed a small window on the north side of the house that was partially hidden by a large pine tree. It took me 20 minutes to work the window open and squeeze through into what appeared to be a guest bathroom. I could hear voices coming from the main living area, so I made my way carefully through the house, staying in the shadows and avoiding the areas where I might be seen. Dominique and Garrett were in the kitchen, preparing dinner. They looked like any other couple enjoying a quiet evening at home, if you ignored the fact that one of them was married to someone else. I still can't believe Dave fired me, Dominique was saying as she chopped vegetables. 18 months with the company, and he throws me away because of some anonymous photos. It's probably for the best, Garrett replied, opening a bottle of wine. You were wasted at that place anyway. You're too talented to be working for someone else. Easy for you to say. You're not the one who's unemployed. You won't be unemployed for long. Once we're married, you won't need to work unless you want to. Dominique stopped chopping and looked at him. Are we really going to get married? Of course we are, as soon as your divorce is finalized. What about Victor? He's going to fight me on everything. The house, the savings, probably even the furniture. Garrett moved behind her and put his arms around her waist. Let me worry about Victor. I have ways of dealing with men like him. What do you mean? I mean there are people who specialize in making problems disappear. Permanently. I felt my adrenaline spike. Was Garrett actually talking about having me eliminated? You're not serious, Dominique said, but there was uncertainty in her voice. Completely serious. Victor has become a liability. He's harassing us, vandalizing my property, interfering with my business relationships. Something needs to be done. Garrett, you're scaring me. You don't need to be scared. You just need to trust me. I'd heard enough. I stepped out of the shadows and into the kitchen doorway. Trust him? I said. That's interesting advice coming from a man who's about to lose everything he owns. They both spun around, their faces white with shock. Dominique dropped the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables, and it clattered on the floor. Victor, she gasped. How did I get in? Same way I got in last week when I redecorated your boyfriend's Ferrari. Garrett stepped in front of Dominique, trying to protect her. You're trespassing. I'm calling the police. Go ahead, I said. I'm sure they'll be very interested in hearing about your business associates, the ones who visited you the other night, the ones who looked like they'd be more comfortable breaking legs than closing real estate deals. Garrett's face went even paler. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? I know you're broke, Garrett. I know you owe money to some very dangerous people. I know this house doesn't even belong to you. That's not true, Dominique said, but her voice lacked conviction. I pulled out the folder Mike had given me and tossed it on the kitchen counter. It's all in there, sweetheart. Property records, court documents, financial statements. Your boyfriend is a fraud. Dominique picked up the folder with trembling hands and began flipping through the documents. With each page she turned, her expression grew more horrified. This can't be right, she whispered. It's all public record, I said. Anyone can look it up if they know where to look. Garrett lunged toward me, but I was ready for him. I sidestepped his clumsy attack and grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against the kitchen wall. You want to fight? I said. Let's fight, but let's do it like men, not like the coward you really are. I released him and stepped back, giving him room to make his move. But instead of attacking, he just stood there, breathing heavily and looking defeated. You don't understand, he said. Those people I owe money to, they don't accept bankruptcy as an excuse. If I don't pay them back, they'll hurt me. They'll hurt anyone connected to me. Including Dominique? He nodded miserably. I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I could turn things around, make enough money to pay them off. But everything I touch turns to dust. I looked at Dominique, who was still staring at the documents in shock. This is the man you left me for? This pathetic, lying coward? She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. I didn't know. Didn't you? Or did you just not want to know? I thought... You thought what? That he was better than me? That he could give you the life you deserved? Yes, she whispered. Well, congratulations. You got exactly what you asked for. I walked over to the kitchen window and looked out at the lake. The water was dark and still, reflecting the lights from the house like scattered stars. Here's what's going to happen, I said without turning around. Garrett is going to disappear from our lives. He's going to leave town, change his name if he has to, and never contact either of us again. I can't just leave, Garrett protested. I have obligations. Your obligations are what got you into this mess. Your only obligation now is to survive. I turned back to face them. And Dominique, you're going to file for divorce. You're going to take whatever settlement I offer, and you're going to rebuild your life somewhere else. What if I don't want a divorce? She asked quietly. Then you're stupider than I thought. Because the man you married doesn't exist anymore. He died the night you called him a dog. I walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at them one last time. Oh, and Sasha sends her regards. She wanted me to tell you how much she enjoyed manipulating you both. I left them standing in the kitchen and walked out into the night. Behind me, I could hear Dominique starting to cry, and Garrett trying unsuccessfully to comfort her. The dog had learned to bite, and the taste was even sweeter than I'd imagined. But I wasn't done yet. There was one more move to make, one final act that would complete my transformation from victim to victor, and I was going to savor every moment of it. The Riverside Community Center was hosting its annual charity gala, a black tie affair that drew the social elite from 3 counties. It was the kind of event Dominique had always wanted to attend, but never could, because tickets cost $500 per person, and we'd never had that kind of disposable income. This year, I bought a table for 8. I spent the week before the gala making phone calls and extending invitations. Dave Millant, Dominique's former boss, Jim Patterson, the client whose affair with Sasha I'd exposed years ago, several of Garrett's business associates who were probably wondering where their money had gone, the mayor, who'd been photographed with Garrett at several ribbon-cutting ceremonies, the editor of the local newspaper, who'd written puff pieces about Garrett's development projects. I even invited Detective Sandra Bell, who'd been investigating some of Garrett's more questionable business practices. The gala was held in the center's main ballroom, a space that had been transformed with white tablecloths, crystal chandeliers, and enough flowers to stock a funeral home. A jazz quartet played softly in the corner, while waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. I arrived fashionably late, wearing a tuxedo I'd rented for the occasion. I looked good, better than I had in years. The past 2 weeks of working out with Mike had toned my muscles and improved my posture, and the weight I'd lost from the stress had actually made me look younger. Several people did double takes as I walked through the crowd. Victor Mercer, the blue-collar contractor, looking like he belonged among the country club set. I made my way to my table, greeting my guests and making small talk about business and local politics. Everyone was being polite, but I could sense the underlying tension. They all knew something was happening, but they weren't sure what. At 8:30, just as the main course was being served, Dominique walked in. She was wearing a red dress that I'd never seen before, something elegant and expensive that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Her hair was styled in an elaborate updo, and her makeup was flawless. She looked beautiful, sophisticated, and completely out of place. She was alone. I watched as she stood in the doorway, scanning the crowd for a familiar face. When her eyes met mine across the room, I raised my champagne glass in a mock toast. She looked away quickly and made her way to the bar. "Isn't that your wife?" asked Jim Patterson, who was sitting to my right. "Ex-wife," I corrected. "The divorce was finalized yesterday. I heard she was having some personal difficulties." Nothing that a good lawyer couldn't handle. The evening's program began with a speech from the mayor about community development and economic growth. He talked about successful local businessmen who were investing in the area's future, and he specifically mentioned Garrett Stone as an example of entrepreneurial vision. I smiled and took another sip of champagne. After the mayor finished, there was a charity auction featuring donated items from local businesses, a weekend at a luxury resort, dinner for 2 at the city's most expensive restaurant, a round of golf at the country club. When the auctioneer called for the final item, a painting donated by a local artist, I stood up. "Excuse me," I said loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "Before we continue, I'd like to make an announcement." The auctioneer looked confused. "Sir, this isn't really the appropriate time." "Oh, I think it's the perfect time," I said, walking toward the small stage at the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Victor Mercer, and I have something important to share with all of you." A murmur ran through the crowd. I could see Dominique at the bar, her face white with panic. Several people were already reaching for their phones, probably to record whatever was about to happen. 2 weeks ago, I continued, my wife told me that I was passive and weak. She compared me to a dog sitting obediently while real men took control of their lives. The murmur grew louder. People were turning in their seats to get a better look at me. She was having an affair, you see, with a prominent local businessman. A man who promised her wealth and status and everything she thought she deserved. I could see Detective Bell leaning forward in her chair, suddenly very interested in what I had to say. That man was Garrett Stone. The room erupted in whispers and gasps. I waited for the noise to die down before continuing. Now, I'm sure you're all wondering where Mr. Stone is tonight. After all, he's usually the star of events like this, isn't he? Always ready with a speech about economic development and community investment. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. The truth is, Garrett Stone left town 3 days ago. He's currently driving west in a rental car, trying to stay ahead of some very angry creditors. I opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of photographs, copies of the financial documents Mike had obtained, along with some additional information I'd gathered on my own. You see, Mr. Stone's business empire was built on borrowed money and false promises. He owes approximately $2.7 million to various creditors, including some gentlemen from Chicago who don't typically use traditional collection methods. Detective Bell was now standing up, her hand moving toward her phone. The lake house where he entertained my wife, owned by the bank, the Ferrari he drove around town, leased with a credit line that's been frozen, the development projects he was always talking about, financed with money that belonged to other people. I could see Dave Millant whispering urgently to the man sitting next to him. Jim Patterson was staring at me with a mixture of admiration and fear. But here's the really interesting part, I continued. Mr. Stone didn't just steal from banks and legitimate investors. He also took money from people who solved their business disputes with baseball bats and concrete shoes. The room had gone completely silent. Even the waiters had stopped moving. So when my wife asked me why I couldn't be more like her successful boyfriend, I decided to show her exactly what kind of man he really was. It turns out that successful men sometimes aren't as successful as they appear. I looked directly at Dominique, who was now crying openly at the bar. My ex-wife is unemployed, homeless, and discovering that the man she thought would rescue her from her boring marriage has actually left her in a worse position than she started in. I folded the papers and put them back in the envelope. The moral of the story, ladies and gentlemen, is this. Be careful what you wish for, because you just might get it. I walked back to my table, sat down, and took another sip of champagne. The room remained silent for several long moments before the auctioneer nervously returned to his microphone. "Well," he said uncertainly, "shall we continue with the auction?" But nobody was paying attention to the auction anymore. People were pulling out their phones, making calls, sending text messages. The story would be all over social media within an hour, and in the newspaper by morning. Detective Bell approached my table during dessert. "Mr. Mercer," she said quietly, "I'd like to speak with you privately." Of course. We walked to a quiet corner of the ballroom, away from the crowd. "The information you shared tonight," she said. "How did you obtain it?" "Public records, mostly. Property filings, court documents, business registrations. Anyone can access them if they know where to look." "And the part about his creditors from Chicago?" "I observed some men visiting his property. They didn't look like typical business associates." She nodded thoughtfully. "We've been investigating Mr. Stone for several months. Money laundering, fraud, racketeering. Your information might be very helpful to our case. Happy to cooperate with law enforcement. What about your wife, ex-wife? Do you think she was involved in any of his illegal activities?" I looked across the room at Dominique, who was now sitting alone at a table near the back, ignored by everyone around her. "No," I said. "She was just a victim of her own ambition." Detective Bell handed me her business card. If you think of anything else that might be relevant to our investigation, please call me. After she left, I returned to my table to find my guests preparing to leave. The evening was winding down, and people were eager to get home and start making phone calls about what they'd witnessed. "Hell of a speech, Victor," said Jim Patterson as he shook my hand. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." "Just treat your wife better than I treated mine," I replied. Dave Millant was the last to leave. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think Dominique made a terrible mistake. You're a good man." "No," I said, "I'm not a good man anymore, but I'm an honest one." After my guests had gone, I walked over to where Dominique was sitting. She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. "Are you happy now?" she asked. "Yes," I said simply. "I am. You've destroyed everything. My job, my relationship, my reputation. Was it worth it?" "You destroyed our marriage first. I just returned the favor." She wiped her eyes with a napkin. "What happens now? Now you figure out how to rebuild your life, just like I had to. I don't have anywhere to go. That's not my problem anymore." I started to walk away, then turned back. "Dominique? What? Next time you're tempted to compare your husband to a dog, remember this. Dogs are loyal until you betray them, but once you do, they never forget." I left her sitting alone in the ballroom and walked out into the cool night air. My truck was parked in the lot behind the community center, looking out of place among all the luxury cars and SUVs. As I drove back toward town, I thought about the last 3 weeks and how completely my life had changed. I'd gone from being a victim to being the architect of my own revenge. I'd learned that I was capable of things I'd never imagined, both good and bad. The dog had learned to bite, and the lesson had been more satisfying than I'd ever expected. But as I pulled into the parking lot of the Sunset Motel, I realized that my transformation wasn't complete yet. I was no longer the man I'd been, but I wasn't sure who I was becoming. I parked my truck and looked up at the stars visible through the clear night sky. Tomorrow I would start the next chapter of my life. I would find a new place to live, maybe in a different town. I would rebuild my business, make new friends, maybe even find love again someday. But tonight, I was content to sit in my truck and savor the taste of victory. It was bitter and sweet at the same time, like dark chocolate or good whiskey. The dog had learned to bite, and he'd discovered that he had very sharp teeth indeed. I got out of my truck and walked toward my motel room, my footsteps echoing in the quiet night. Behind me, the lights of the city twinkled like